So at this point, we're about 5 videos into the Second Opinion sub-series of reviews, and I can safely say I've found my footing for what I want this project to be. Whilst it's obvious to me, however, it might not necessarily be clear to many of this channel's viewers. I mean, for a large portion of old videos, the reasoning is obvious. They have quickly become outdated as the channel format has improved, so it makes sense to bring them up to the same standard. However, I have another reason for wanting to redo some of them. When I first started this channel, I was a far more cynical person. I didn't quite understand the intricacies of criticism, and I thought being well-spoken equated to nitpicking every single thing about a figure to the ends of the earth. As my collecting journey progresses though, I found myself mellowing out to a lot of releases. This of course was quite obvious with the re-review of Takara Legends Slipstream, a release that I feel gets crapped on far too much. Yes, I did participate in such tirades, but I've since rectified such a mistake. That being said, there's one other figure that I feel I was way too harsh on when it first released. Or rather, 6 other figures. I'm not one to deny that it was plagued with issues, nor am I one to erase such issues, but in the context of third parties' evolution over the years, maybe I was too harsh. Greetings Cybertronians, I'm Dr. Lockdown, and welcome back to another Second Opinion. Today's final diagnosis in the 4th season of the Legendary Marathon, albeit a little bit late, pertains to DX9 Warren Pocket's Hulky, or more commonly known as Devastator. Okay, so a bit of housekeeping before we jump into things. Just 2 bits to touch upon. Number 1, these all have their own special third-party names, but given the confusion about which is which, I'll just be going by the original G1 names. Hasbro purists can get as mad as they like, but it's my channel and my rules. Secondly, these 6 are all supposed to come with tiny guns, 6 for the bots themselves, and a 7th for Scourge, who apparently didn't get one in the original release. If you've been with this channel for a while, you can probably guess what's happened to them over the years. Gone. Honestly though, not much of value has been lost here, and hey, I get to live in some angry commenters' heads rent-free as a bit for a result. Always humorous. But moving on to the review proper, let's go into a little bit of background. At the dawn of third-party Legends, Iron Factory saw what Hasbro was doing with their Legends class and decided to follow suit with an upgrade kit for Thrilling 13 Metroplex. Soon after, however, they realized they could do a lot better by just following this scale to its logical conclusion, and when they started gaining traction, DX9 took a peek and saw potential profits. They started their Warren Pocket series, and although they always lagged behind Iron Factory quality-wise, they still found their niche and did quite well. Of these releases, none were more hype-inducing than their Devastator project. Hasbro only dabbled in this play pattern at this size, to varying degrees of success. So of course, all eyes were locked on this then upcoming version. For all intents and purposes, this was uncharted territory. So how exactly did it fare? Well, starting off in vehicle mode, things are looking pretty good. Yes, the Constructicons are a very difficult set to get wrong in vehicle mode, which makes the Combiner Wars version even more pitiful. And yes, they weren't exactly competing with anyone at the time thanks to Iron Factory's less than stellar grasp on how to properly design a space car. Jesus Christ, that's a poor attempt. But even by their own merits, these are still pretty well designed. Starting off with Mixmaster, here's pretty much what you'd want from the size class. Now, full disclosure, these all have repro labels applied to them. I'm going to try and primarily focus on the paint applications though, since they aren't extremely necessary, as cool as they are. As for the mixer truck itself, it's pretty cohesive despite having to fit in a third mode. I do feel the back section might be a little undersized, or maybe the front section is a little oversized, but for the most part, it looks pretty cool. I adore the glossy purple they've used on the windows. It pops way more than any form of flat purple could. It even has a metallic fleck to it. Nice touch. The grille section is also pretty well done too. It's a hefty departure from the original, both in size and mechanical detail design, but I dig what they've got going here with the gridded look. I also love the use of the purple barrel back here. I know it's more of a Sunbow thing than a toy thing, but come on man, the color breakup is much more appreciated here. It also spins pretty well too, providing hours of fun. Beyond that, the gap between the cab and the mixing section is pretty small too, allowing for a more cohesive design overall. Well, at least more cohesive than the G1 version. In fact, this truck mode is pretty cohesive on the whole, considering it has to fit another 2 modes into it. The arms pretty snugly fit into the back, forming a really solid bumper section despite the lack of detail. And I love how the guns become exhaust pipes. And sure, you do get a couple of hinges on the top, but once again, this is a prime time to bring out the sign. I know some people are getting annoyed with it after all this time, but I don't really care. There's not particularly much I can complain about with this member. I guess people could get mad that the wheels aren't pinned, instead only sculpted on. Is one of 2 wheeled members that have this supposed issue, ignoring those with Caterpillar treads since they don't count. Personally, I consider this a complete non-issue. Aside from the sizing and the fact that it is essentially a triple changer, I've never really considered functional wheels the most important thing on a Legends figure. On anything deluxe class and higher, sure, but on something this small, I don't see why it's worth complaining about. If you don't see it as an issue, or if you're at least able to look past it, he's a pretty damn good Mixmaster in this mode. Great start to the set easily. That said, moving on to Scrapper, he definitely turns up the weird factor. This is by no means a bad alternate mode, but there are clear oddities at play. At least he rolls though, a win for the wheel purists, although his wheels are oddly large for the size of the figure. Yes, the G1 toy had rather large wheels to begin with, but this just feels excessive. Still, the rest of the design looks pretty neat. The scoop at the front has been given quite the upgrade, providing plenty of posing power, affording you a lot of play options. It has been sized up for the sake of the combined mode, but I feel this works much better than the proportional issues with Mixmaster, and those weren't even that bad to begin with. The gloss purple paint makes its return in full force, covering all the windows. It's a fairly big departure from the original design, whether toon or toy, but for stability reasons I do get it. Most updates follow this design philosophy anyway. In front of it you get a lot of silver highlights to prevent the top from getting stale, and that paint continues to the back to pick out a few pistons. It's not a crazy amount, and it's definitely overshadowed by the repro labels applied on the sides, but it gets the job done. And sure, the back section is a bit messy with minimal detail on Sho and Knees trying and failing to masquerade as taillights, but again, we get to bring up the sign. Scrapper is a much simpler beast with a lot less to talk about in the grand scheme of things, but that's because for the most part, he's just a solid excavator. I do have two complaints though, and these aren't necessarily easy to overlook. Firstly, you have to deal with this pretty substantial gap on the side to account for the foot transformation. In the years since the first review, I've softened up to it thanks to understanding the engineering limitations DX9 had at the time. They weren't dealing with new age engineering then, so I do get it. But even so, this is still pretty annoying. Though I'd argue it's not as annoying as the second issue. This guy is way too big. I'm not a scale nut by any means. In fact, for the most part, I don't give a flying f about size discrepancies. But this was to such a level where it pushed even my buttons. It really feels like it should have been smaller. Maybe making the driving section smaller to create the illusion of a smaller scale would have helped, and sure, this criticism might seem hypocritical since I've given passes to sets like Studio Series Devastator, but that set at least had the excuse of being such a weird design to begin with. This is just plain old G1 Devastator, and the proportions and sizing just feel weird. It almost feels like this vehicle is from a completely different set sometimes. Still, not quite enough to make me want to write this entire figure off. It's still a fun time thanks to the play value of the scoop, so I can't really complain. Anywho, finally getting to the waist, long haul is adorable. Thanks to the proportions of the combined mode, this Ultra mode ends up awfully squished. You can see in comparison to the G1 version that the front is immensely flattened, and the bed is a lot shorter. But goddammit, it makes this the cutest dump truck I've ever seen. It almost has a super deformed quality to it, and it really works. Now compared to the other 5, this easily has the least paint in this mode. You still get all the hallmarks of the set like the purple windows that still look awesome, and the front has a few cool sections picked out. But unless you go for the Toy Hack stickers to pick out some of the detail on the back, most of the interest comes from the mechanical detail. Fortunately, the set goes pretty hard on such with all the struts you could require from a truck bed. It's not the most detailed vehicle from the set, but it still looks really cool. It's also, once again, really cohesive with minimal kibble on show and parts that fit together extremely well, despite having a pretty interesting transformation. I mean, sure, you have to deal with the combined waist on the back, but it folds up pretty well and even provides some nice headlight detail. Would have been nice if they picked these out in paint, but it's still neat either way. As I've said quite a bit in this review already, there's not much I can really complain about here, save for some alignment issues. Getting everything 100% flush isn't really gonna happen. There's always going to be a slight angle. That said, it's not something you really notice unless you're really scrutinizing it, and you'll definitely not notice it in group shots. And sure, ultimately there's not a lot to talk about in general, even less so than Scrapper, but it's easily another solid entry into the set. Sadly, that sentiment does not echo over to Hook, who is easily the most compromised of the bunch. I'd be hard-pressed to call this alt mode bad, but it's definitely made a whole heap of sacrifices for the sake of the combined mode. For context, Hulky does not follow the traditional G1 combiner system. With the exception of the fists, all combining parts are fully integrated. As a marketing gimmick, this works really well. A large portion of the fandom got really excited for this release, since in their eyes it acts as a true combiner. Using excessive parts forming in their eyes is cheating. Now, my relationship with parts forming is a complicated one, not just because of my frustrations with a certain Earthrise release. I don't mind parts forming when it becomes a weapon or even a kick-ass shield, and I certainly don't mind combining parts forming. I only dislike it when it's incorporated just because the designers couldn't figure out how to integrate a part properly, which is why Cliffjumper pisses me off so much. When it comes to combining parts forming though, a lot of people think it's necessary and a lot of people think it's a cardinal sin. My main concern is that whenever companies try to incorporate practically everything in, compromises are made. The only time where I've seen it done well is Mastermind Creations' Bruticus, and even then Vortex and Blastoff had to make some sacrifices. Plus it arguably looks better with at least the foot attachments. But back to Hook, you can tell that through the process of engineering all the combiner parts into the body, cohesion has been massively I mean, the front section looks alright at least, and the thighs actually blend in quite well with the front of the truck. It's also better proportioned than the G1 toy, which is a plus. The purple paint makes its return, which I continue to go nuts over, but beyond that, things get pretty messy. I'm not saying the G1 toy looks that great with its obviously visible hinge system, but it was certainly better than the double hinge head combo. The arms back here are also a complete joke, barely integrating at all into the design. And what the f*** is this hook? This dinky old thing barely stands out at all. The lack of articulation I can accept, thanks to the engineering required to get it to work, but the size? It's way too small. It didn't have to be either. This looks weird because it has to fold up into the combined chest, which is already undersized to begin with. Had they made this bigger, they could have fixed both problems in one fell swoop. Plus, beyond all the combination issues, the windows on the side look oddly bloated. It's a similar look to Earthrise Alicon's head, yet I can't really put my finger on why they don't work. I don't know, this just feels like they gave up when faced with the challenges of engineering the chest. There were probably ways to work around this, but they didn't even try to figure them out. That's the feeling I get from this, and I could be wrong, but ultimately, it's probably the worst alt mode of the set either way. Oh well, at least it's sized well and fits with the rest. Every combiner has a weak link anyway, and thankfully it isn't a total stinker. If this is the worst the set gets, they've done alright. Fortunately, Hook really is the worst, because Scrapper picks the quality right back up with a hella cool alt mode. For starters, the proportions are spot on. He's a perfectly pudgy little excavator, squished in most directions to emphasize the adorability. You could make the argument that is a little messier than the others, perhaps even more than Hook, but thanks to a few clear points of interest, you don't tend to notice the exposed arms and head. The cockpit section, at least I think it's called the cockpit section, brings the gloss purple back to the forefront. Only now it isn't bloated like poor old Captain Hook over here. Surprisingly, the purple is a completely different shade to that of the treads. They likely could have gotten away with reusing it, but I'm glad they went the extra mile, especially with how much paint these sections have. In fact, thanks to the bot mode details being visible in this mode, the paint quantity is quite high here. Fortunately, it never feels overbearing though. It always feels purposeful and just reserved enough. Ultimately, this is another figure with no flaws that really detract from the overall experience. Sure, you've got the hip ball joint to the front here, but once again, we get to bring out that ever-present sign, as condescending as it may seem. I mean, even the kibble folds up seamlessly. Considering the near all-inclusive combining element, that's pretty commendable. Of course, if you're absolutely dead set on avoiding parts forming altogether, you can leave the fists on here. They look horrible, but it's an option. With it removed though, you get access to the final cherry on top, a fully articulated top section. This is ridiculously fun to mess with, and extremely commendable given how many versions omit such for the sake of engineering. I think with the existence of this version, we can finally tell such reasoning is bullshit. So ultimately, this ends up being my favorite of the set. Sure, it's a little petite in comparison to the rest, but I reckon that just adds to the adorability factor. If you want to get just one, which is entirely possible thanks to the multitude of KOs on the market these days, this would be the one to go with, at least for this mode. Unfortunately, I wouldn't recommend the same for Bone Crusher, because although he isn't the worst of the set in this mode, he is pretty close to the bottom. Now, to be fair, the original isn't the most stellar in vehicle mode either, with a severe lack of purple, but at least it didn't make it obvious the arms were just chilling on the top. With the DX9 version, the segmentation of the arms makes it painfully clear what these are supposed to be. It's teetering on the line of pulling out the sign and actually requiring criticism, and in the end I think it just pushes through to the latter. Moving down, I will give them this. The green paint on the treads does look awesome. It's far better than old Green Hill Zone back here in the 80s. But aside from that, there's not much color breakup at all. Yes, it's G1 toy and Toon accurate, but they've already deviated with the others to great effect. This seems to be using accuracy as a crutch more than anything. Surprisingly though, this isn't my biggest gripe. It's the lack of paint on the windshield. Yep, this is a repro label, so it looks fine now, but initially it had nothing. It's the only Constructicon out of the 6 to not incorporate the gorgeous glossy purple. No idea why they omitted such. It doesn't make much sense when this set has a pretty hefty price tag to begin with. The head is also completely visible back here, to the point where once again the sign doesn't really cut it. Yes, this was the same on the original, but that at least had the canopy over the top. This doesn't get that luxury for whatever reason, and it really sucks. Oh well, at least you get some posability on the scoop, and I suppose it's sized well. Plus, even with all the complaints here, as well as the complaints with this set in general, me, these look good together. Some may say it's impossible to make the Constructicons look bad in a group, but after seeing how the Combiner Wars edition tackled it, I've come to realize there's a lot more thought that needs to go into things. DX9 have indeed brought a high level of vehicle mode care to the table, so at least this is a solid set in that regard. In fact, for many years, that was their strong suit. DX9 was extremely well known for the quality of their vehicle modes. Or were they? See, I have a hypothesis. Maybe people weren't actually that enamored with their alt modes, but rather they were clinging onto them due to massive sacrifices with the robots. But that couldn't be true of this set, right? Right? Hello there? One thing this set has over other versions of the lineup is its simple and effective transformation. The other two versions currently on the market have been getting criticism recently over their overcomplicated transformations. Even New Age, which is weird because usually their transformations are great. So at least these guys are pretty simple and pretty fun to flip back and forth. Their problems don't lie with the transformation. The transformations are fine. Well, of course that is with one exception, that being Mixmaster. His transformation is a bit underdone. First thing you want to do is rotate the knees up like that, and now you've got legs. And then you bring out the feet and, oh, they're not finished. They don't go all the way. Gee, I hope that won't be a problem later, but anyway, what you want to do is separate the legs like so. Wow, why are they so tight? Come to the top and separate the arms like so. Rotate them into place like so. And last but not least, don't forget to bring the guns down like so. For Scrapper, what you want to do is come around to the sides and bring the arms out on their hinges. They're on hinges and ball joints, and the hinges come out and the ball joints just kind of sit there. That will give you enough clearance to bring out the legs like so on the knees. And then you come around to the feet, rotate this inward like that, and push it in like so on the sliding rail. Not a fan of sliding rails, but this feels alright. Thanks to the material they chose, this doesn't feel like it's going to break down over time. And same with the torso. It also just goes boom, like that, nice and simple. And then you use the double hinges to get the backpack into place and rotate the arms around, and we're done. Nice little Scrapper. Long haul's actually pretty cool. You want to bring the top panels down like that. Bring this section down on its double hinge like that. That'll give you enough clearance to bring the legs out like so. Come to the bottom, the waist is on a double hinge that rotates into place like so. You're going to want to separate the legs and then bring in the combiner crotch plate towards the back, and then bring the legs back into place. Now that you've got enough clearance, you can bring the wheels towards the back and fold up the hip skirts like so. Well, the combiner hip skirts anyway. You want to pull out the arms, rotate them around, and then push them back into place, and they lock in there. Nice little rotation that works like so. Rotate the arms into place and rotate the head up and around, and long haul is done. Hook's transformation is adequate. His problems aren't with the transformation. This is mainly what I was getting at earlier, because the issues are with both of the modes in particular. With a little bit more time in the oven, he probably could have been much better, but well. You want to rotate the hook up like that, bring out the legs like so, bring out your legs, separate them there, and no heel spurs. Gee, I hope that doesn't become a problem later. Separate the arms from the top there. You've got hinges that bring the shoulders down into place. Rotate the arms into place, and then fold up the ponytail like that. Moving on to the arms, Scavenger actually has a very similar transformation to that of Studio Series Scrap Metal, and it's interesting because this figure predates Scrap Metal by several years. Did Shogo Hasui take a look at this and maybe inspire it by that? I don't think so. I think it's just a coincidence, but it's a nice little coincidence. You bring up the arms on these hinges like that, they fold out and fold out like that, then they rotate down into place, bring up the head, and then that'll give you enough clearance to fold in the scoop like that, and the scoop also pushes all the way up there. Should be hanging down there, but you just push it in just a little bit. Come to the bottom and separate the legs from the bottom there. Rotate these around on this sort of faux ratchet into place. Rotate the shins around into place, and then the feet fold out along with the heel spurs. This is a nice little approximation between Scavenger's and Bone Crusher's leg transformations. It allows them to have shared engineering and shared parts across both versions. And they work once, so they work both times. And last but not least, Bone Crusher, who is very similar to his G1 counterpart. In fact, the most similar out of the set, I would say. You separate the arms from the top and they rotate around into place. Head rotates up. Keep the scoop down. Do the legs the same as with Scavenger. So they rotate around with the shins and do their thing. Even though they're different colors, they're the same parts. And then the scoop folds into place to become the chest. And it doesn't lock in, it just kind of sits there. That is a bit annoying, but it is what it is. And we're done. So yeah, I've got my problems with this set, but none of them pertain to the transformations. DX9 did decent transformations. They could be undercooked at times, and there was one case where they were really, really bad. But for the most part, much like the members of Hulky over here, they were solid. These are solid transformations. What can I say? Not much to delve into here. Now here's something that newer viewers might not be aware of. I have always been pretty critical when it comes to DX9's War and Pocket series. Their masterpiece stuff always impresses, even including the stuff that wasn't particularly for me, but they always seem to fall short with their small-scale entries. People seemed to go nuts over many of their releases, however, I always suspected it was simply the novelty of having G1 accurate figures at such a small scale. Aside from Hasbro, no one else was really doing G1 figures at this size, so for many people it was probably a fun distraction from the constant bickering over which slap of grey plastic was more accurate to the shoestring budget toy advertisement. Now to answer the question of where my annoyances with this company started, we need look no further than the robot modes. Every figure, without fail, buggers something up. There's never a moment where I don't feel disappointed with these. Going in the same order as last time, we might as well rename Mixed Master to Flat Master because he gives pancakes a run for their money. This is clearly a figure where the designer didn't care for the proportions when he was sketching out the basic CAD model, and instead of correcting his mistake, he kept kept going and going, and we ended up with this abomination. The chest has a decent amount of paint on it for sure, even with the slightly underdone red, but there's basically no definition on the detail. I get that the original toy was also pretty flat, but at least he had some outward chunk to make up for it. This one looks straight out of a Tom and Jerry cartoon. The head is also pretty bad too, or should I say the head plate, since there isn't even enough room back here to fill out a whole head. It's not difficult to get a Legends head sculpt right. With such a small size, you're afforded a lot more leeway. Despite this, they still managed to give us a triumphant return of Pat Lee's Dull Surprise. If Dull Surprise even can be triumphant. And what the f is up with these legs? The feet don't fully extend, so he's forever on his tippy toes, which does hell for the stability. I don't get why these are like this anyway. No version of Mixmaster had legs like this. I like it when designers deviate from the source material to give us new and interesting ideas, but these legs are like the truck mode on the Combiner Wars version. It's stupid, unfinished, and should have just been left the same as the original. Hello there. Dr. Lockdown from the future here. As part of the usual editing process, I looked around for some stock photography of this set. While doing that, I came across the TFW threads, and in it were a lot of photos of the prototypes. Turns out for most of the development, they did actually plan on making these feet work properly. So I gotta ask, what the f happened? It's not that hard to engineer feet in there properly. Why the f did they just stop short? It really ties into the same issue that keeps plaguing this set, at least from my perspective. The team working on this constantly reaches walls in the design process, and instead of figuring out ways to scale those walls, they kinda just give up. It's constantly happening at every single point with this release, and this is seriously better evidence than anything I came across when I was researching for the script. I guess at least the articulation functions, albeit barely. There's no real bells and whistles, although given the time period, I'm not particularly expecting any. Yeah, the lack of a head swivel really sucks, but I can't see a way they could have engineered this properly. Don't get me wrong, there are cool ideas here, but it really feels like the robot mode wasn't the priority. That to me seems like a real dangerous way of thinking. Triple changes are hard to do for sure, but when you give up one of the 3 modes, the whole package falls apart due to the lack of a centralized play idea. I'm not saying make no sacrifices in any mode, I'm just saying at least make an effort on all 3. Jeez, I can't even look at this thing anymore. Can we move on, please? Much better. Scrapper brings the chunk with probably the best robot mode of the bunch. Sure, it likely comes from the fact that once again he is the most out of scale with the rest of them, but we've already gone over the complaints for that, and it doesn't make sense to repeat that shit. Besides, at least here you can kinda justify it with the fact that he's the leader of the Constructicons, at least I think so. Pretty sure he was last time I checked. Unlike his partner in Leg Crime, he actually has a really good head sculpt, emphasizing the meanness of the faceplates. Sure, much like the rest of the red paint, the visor could have used an extra coat, but it works well enough. It also sits atop an actually well-layered torso design. And yes, it has been enhanced with repro labels, but it still looks pretty damn good without. The monolithic chest makes the hollowness on the sides incredibly hard to notice, and the hip section feels supernatural. Even the chunky arms work well here with their hella cool shoulder wheels and Titans Return-esque fist armor. And on top of that, the feet work better with a clear aesthetic on the shins and proper ankles, which trust me will become a luxury later. And sure, they're pretty hollow from the back, but that's not considered a flaw in my book, so go find another channel if you want someone to complain about them. Honestly, there are only 2 issues I can point out here, and both are in relation to the articulation. For the most part, everything functions to the level it should, which is actually a relief in a set like this. But there are a few cases where the designers made pretty weird decisions. Firstly, the head has no rotation at all. They hollowed it from the back to cut costs, and it really plays hell with the personality. Second, the thighs are fully painted in silver. They look fantastic, but out of the box, they're super tight. Over time, they have loosened up on my copy, and maybe bootlegs won't have this issue. But if you're buying this mint and sealed box, you may want to be careful when posing him, lest you tear the whole thing off. I've seen cases of that, and believe me, it ain't pretty. But that aside, it's a solid little scrapper. He's a fun little Decepticon and a cool representation if the other 2 don't do it for you. To be honest though, the only reason he's considered the best of the 6 in this mode is because he's the least problematic. He's good, don't get me wrong, but he doesn't necessarily go above and beyond. Still, in comparison to the others, that's quite the privilege, because Longhaul may look great, but oh boy, they made some dumb decisions here. But first, the good. The head sculpt looks pretty rad. Sure, it's a bit more squared off thanks to having to fit snugly into the truck mode, sort of like a Titans Return faceplate of a non-headmaster character, but the roundness still shines through really well, and he literally shines with all the silver paint. The flat truck bonnet makes a lot more sense in this mode too, forming an awesome wide boy torso aesthetic. In fact, the proportions here are awesome. Sure, the shoulders are a little low, but that doesn't detract from the powerhouse look at all. The color breakup is also great, with a crisp, clean G-string and powerful purple and silver thighs. I also dig how the legs fill in the scoop parts. I know it's not accurate to the toy or the show, but it's a neat form of stylization that I wish would appear on more long hauls. No, not like that! Either way, he's a fantastic looking long haul and works well in a standard pose. So, what in particular is the problem here? Well, it's what happens once you get out of a standard pose. Above the waist, his articulation is pretty good. Sure, he lacks the sideways elbow action that was memed to death on the Combiner Wars version, but honestly, I'd take traditional ball joints any day. The problem lies below the thighs. No thigh swivels. At all. Now, part of me does get this. Longhaul basically pulls a Combiner Wars Motormaster with his hips, albeit much more effectively thanks to an actual crotch piece. At this size, I'd understand if the lack of a thigh swivel was to make the combined mode more sturdy. Except the combined mode doesn't have a thigh swivel either. What the f***, man? I'd be cool if at least one mode had it, but neither does. So the sacrifices on both fronts make no sense. And it's not like it wouldn't have been possible to engineer the stuff in there in the first place. With a simple shrinking of the waist joints, they could have shoved one in there. I'm not saying it would have been easy, as there's a definite delicate balance of engineering with everything lining up, but this decision still seems amateurish to me. Nowhere near as amateurish as Hook's entire existence though, because holy sh**, this looks just straight up unfinished. The head sculpt stinks, bloated as shit in a way no other members are. The chest is well sculpted and ridiculously well painted to the point where no other member compares, but the proportions are all so off, the arms end up looking squished. The head peeking through the tab is fine, and even a bit funny, but there had to be something better to do with the crane at the back here. I'm fine with back kibble, but this isn't back kibble, this is ponytail kibble. What the f***, man? And where the f*** are the heels? With all the kibble back here, there's no f***ing way to get him to stand without leaning over like he's got a stomachache. And sure, the articulation mostly works, but again with the lack of a head swivel? What is this, a Cyberverse Warrior class figure from Wave 1? Actually, I take that back, at least those figures had functioning heels. This robot mode is bad on a simple level. I don't need to get into the nitty gritty on why it doesn't work on a philosophical level. It's all in plain view for everyone to see. As I've stated many times in previous episodes, I don't like talking about figures like this, because it's not engaging on a writing level, so in that case my dislike is multiplied. There's not really much I can say about this one, other than here's the sizing and here's what I think about it. This thing. Fortunately, much like the vehicle mode, Scavenger offers a quick reprieve from the barrage of mediocrity. The head sculpt returns to actually being designed pretty well. Something I've noticed is that the set tends to work better when the faces are mouth-plated, putting a split right down the middle between mean motherfuckers and people who just walked in on Megatron's Smexy time. Regardless, it's well-proportioned, well-painted, and well-detailed. Not much more to ask. I also adore the way the legs work. The paint on show is masterful, although that's mostly thanks to the attention afforded to the vehicle mode. And as for the engineering itself, it's incredibly simple but incredibly effective, successfully working as a homage to both types of leg transformation. He even packs a mean heel, which means despite the kibble on the back, he remains sturdy in any pose. And speaking of back kibble, it folds up remarkably well. Sure, that does cause some hollowness in the combined mode, but for now what they've got going is quite commendable. Overall, it's a pretty decent robot, with the only really point of contention being the torso. Thanks to the way the arms function, there's a bit of hollowness on show. They at least make an attempt to cover it up with a pretty neat incorporated shovel sternum. And the red paint does draw your attention away from such, even with its somewhat lackluster application once again, but from certain angles it's always going to look hollow. Chest hollowness is always something I'll actually take issue with. Do whatever you want with the legs and arms, but keep it out of the torso. Still, I can't say I'm finding myself too frustrated about it. Aside from the usual excuse, it's pretty commendable what the chest does in the first place. Plus beyond that, the angles where it does look bad are few and far between, so when you do catch it on a bad day, you can quickly move on with the effortless posing. And on the topic of such, he poses pretty well. The limbs don't have any caveats that cause you to get frustrated, whether with stability or point lack. The only glaring omission is, once again, the lack of head rotation. It's still as annoying as the rest of them. Still no idea why they didn't bother. Oh well, even then he's definitely one of the better ones. Not as good as Scrapper, but still a worthy addition with decent constitution, adequate sizing, and an aesthetic that doesn't make you want to claw your eyes out. Unfortunately, we can't stay on a high note for very long because we're back to shit city with Bone Crusher. I guess it's cool to get the same awesome legs again, and the green seems a lot less garish in this mode, but everything above the torso is pretty shit. The head sculpt is, once again, about as off as a milk jug in the fridge of a Bay film Canon consultant. I don't get this line. I wrote this several weeks ago and I haven't checked it. I'm guessing because the Canon consultant is lazy and just would leave it in there. I don't know why I wrote that joke. Me. Aside from the wonky chin and once again bloated visor, there's this odd protrusion at the top that doesn't fit in with the proportions at all. I don't know what they were going for here. Both the G1 Toy and Toon made it clear this was leftover vehicle kibble that the head sat inside. Here it just blends into the head itself and fucks with your head as you look at it. That's not the worst proportional issue though, because this torso is way too short. There's no distinction between the chest and waist, and it's way too wide and shrunken overall, making the arms look stumpy as a result. Ironically, it looks better when you slightly mistransform it, pulling the waist up a bit. It slims out the chest, makes it clear which part of the body is which, and doesn't even f with the height too much. He only gains a few millimeters between fan moding, so why you wouldn't do this is beyond me. Hell, why the designers didn't implement such and lock off the joint is beyond me too. It's not like such a feature limits any of the functionality. He still retains the same level of articulation as Scavenger, so nothing is lost here. It just seems like the designers rushed this mode out, since nobody would bother keeping him like this anyway. And that's the feeling I get from this set on the whole, at least in robot mode. It doesn't feel like they sacrificed the robot modes for the combined mode, but rather that they just didn't give a shit. I know DX9 was never particularly that good with their small-scale engineering, not just in comparison to Iron Factory, but also in comparison to their sister company at the time, Unique Toys. But even in comparison to DX9's other releases, this just feels like nobody gave a flying f***. Compromising one mode for the sake of the others is one thing, but not giving a shit is another entirely, with the exception of Perceptor's tank mode because it's adorably wholesome and I won't let anyone say otherwise. Anywho, with all that shit out of the way, mayhaps the combined mode is better? Well, let's hope, dear fellows. Let's hope. If there's one thing I'll give this credit for, it does feel like you are building this set from the ground up. It feels like you're constructing it, which I feel is one of the most important things for a Constructicon set. The combination should feel important. It should feel like you're building a building. Might not make much sense, but that's just something I feel about it. Now, because of the way this is designed, the best way to convert these is to have Long Haul and Scrapper in robot mode, and Bone Crusher, Scavenger, Hook, and Mixmaster in vehicle mode. It's just because of the rather specific connections needed for this, which does make sense. The original combiner was a bit of a mess to combine, and it had very specific connections, so all newer Devastators kind of follow the same templates. Now, as much as I love to start combiners from the ground up, unfortunately, due to the way this works, you have to do Long Haul first. Otherwise, the legs aren't going to connect properly, because Scrapper specifically folds around the connection ports. Just has to be like that. You fold the head around and put it back into vehicle mode configuration, as is the same with the arms, like so. The arms are going to act as the connection pegs to Hook. Then you separate the legs like so, bring this panel from the back, fold out the hip skirts like so, and rotate the whole thing into place. Then rotate the legs down into place like so, and you got the combiner thighs. Come around to the back, rotate the wheels out, and then you got the pegs for the legs like so, which is why we have to do Long Haul first, because you'll notice this peg gets folded around. Speaking of, let's do Scrapper. Now, he essentially transforms back into his vehicle mode configuration, but there are a couple of differences. You don't want to go all the way. You kind of want to go halfway and have everything folded down like that. With the top of the vehicle facing forwards, you have these two slots on the side here and these two pegs here. So the whole thing clamps onto it like that. And then you can transform it back into its vehicle mode configuration like so. It's a very solid connection, and it can be a bit annoying in some circumstances, but for the most part it's okay. Anyway, then you just use the double hinges to get the scoop into place, and we are done. Nice and solid. Unfortunately, Mixmaster does not have as solid a connection point. It's just a peg there. You just fold down the gun so that there's clearance and then peg it into place. So yeah, not as sturdy, but I guess it gets the job done. And last, for Mixmaster, there are dedicated hinges that rotate outwards and it folds into place. You can see that there are special hinges separate from the knees. Legs done. Now for Hook, you want to bring the titular hook all the way to the front like so. Separate the arms and rotate them around to the bottom. And this is very specific. What you want to do is bring the arm with the peg to the middle and the arm with the slot towards the back. It's a bit confusing, but it'll make sense later. You want to bring the head up. That'll give you enough clearance to separate the legs and separate the entire hip section there. You've got double hinges on both of them that rotate around and lock into place on the side. Well, I say lock in, but the locking isn't that solid. And we'll do everything later, because what you want to do is just bring these forward a little bit. Now you've got the slot on the peg and the slot on the peg, and it all lines up like so. It's a bit difficult, which is why you want to do these two first, because once it's in place, it's a lot easier to do things. Now that those are in place, you've got two pegs there that will become one peg and a slot in the torso, and it all slots together like so. Come on, into place. There we go. Now you can come around to the torso, and the reason we didn't do this earlier is because it often comes undone during the transformation when you're trying to peg the whole thing together, but now what you want to do is separate that. You've got two pegs there and two slots on the side there, and it all pegs together. Once it's pegged in, you rotate these into place, and you've got the torso, and you've got the head rotating around like that, and we're good. And the arms both function very simply. What you want to do is come to the bottom and bring out the treads, extend this on its multitude of hinges, and bring out the panel here, peg the treads together, orient the arm forward, and peg in the fist. This was the main reason why they had the shared legs between the two, not just for ease of robot mode design, but more for the combined mode. It was done like this so they could get the arms done properly once, and they wouldn't have to do it again. Nice and simple. And all you have to do is peg them in place. You'll notice on the side there are 2 slots there, and 2 pegs on each arm, and it all just pegs together. It's a bit annoying to get in place sometimes, but it works once it's there. Not the most solid connection in the world, though. They could have made this much sturdier, but well, we have what we have. And once it's all in place, that's it. So yeah, there's a base of a good design here. A lot of the transformation steps are great in concept. It's just once we get to the combined mode itself, that's when things start to fall apart. But you can tell they cared about this mode way more than the other 2 modes. This was the main event, and I can kind of get that. A lot of MP combiners do that these days. But enough dilly-dallying. Let's finish this off. So, this combined mode, this damn combined mode, it's an enigma of combination in itself, and I don't mean in relation to that stupid Prime Wars trilogy MacGuffin. It's a figure of conflict where it does so much right, yet so much stupid. One thing remains undeniable though, the aesthetic is gorgeous. They've modernized the G1 design in just the right ways, tweaking the proportions into a mean physique that puts the Hulk in hulky. The head sculpt is surprisingly awesome, and I say surprisingly because it has a mouth. Its quality bucks the trends of mouths and mouth plates in this set, although I suppose that's only fair given the sizing is closer to their masterpiece offerings. Still, jolly good show. Moving down, I honestly thought I'd hate the chest wings. The idea of play is pretty cool, but the result is one that's fairly undersized in comparison to many of his contemporaries. These days though, I think it really works well with the rest of the stylization, as does the emphasis on Longhaul's truck abdomen. The 2 newer versions appear to be hiding it under layers and layers of cartoon flatness, so having it so prominent is a nice change of pace. Below that, the waist area works insanely well. As mentioned earlier, it's got a similar transformation to that of Combiner Wars Motormaster, but it's handled a lot better here. This is thanks to the thighs properly hiding themselves behind the waist piece, partially due to how inconspicuous they are, and partially because said waist piece isn't just a loosely pegged on loincloth that no one bothered to put any effort into. This also shows how the decision to fill in the dump truck bed in robot mode paid off. These thighs are meaty, blending in seamlessly into the shins below. Said shins are also pretty neat, although it's not really hard on a devastated design considering they essentially take the vehicles wholesale. Something interesting to note though, Mixmaster seems oddly undersized in comparison to Scrapper. I know this is for the sake of robot mode scale, and Scrapper already had issues with this, but maybe I would have criticized him less if his body also followed suit. I don't know, I guess Mixmaster probably would have been better off being redesigned from the ground up, given his multitude of issues. Either way though, looks-wise, this guy is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Even slight proportional issues, such as the forearms being incredibly short, don't tend to jump out at you. DX9 knows how to make a cohesive robot mode when it comes to larger scale bots, and it's clear they put that knowledge to work here. The problems primarily lie in the articulation and solidity. Quickly giving an overview, this guy is missing quite a few points. I suppose it's commendable that a combiner of this magnitude at this scale has this much posing to begin with, but such thoughts do nothing to quell the frustrations for what's missing. What's missing, you may ask? Well, for starters, the elbows get barely any forward motion thanks to the treads getting in the way. They'll work fine outwards, but anything straight ahead refuses to budge. This in itself wouldn't be so frustrating if it didn't have an incredibly deep bend backwards. Sure, it's due to the hollowness, a direct result of the all-in-one combiner gimmick, but it's still there, taunting you, mocking your desire for posing power. Also, yeah, he has hollow radius sections, but these days I don't particularly consider that an issue. Back in the day, I'd make hypocritical complaints by calling out hollowness on this sort of figure, then proceeding to give it a pass on figures from time to time. These days, though, I just don't give a flying f***. But back to the articulation issues again. Longhaul's decision to omit the thigh swivels from the robot mode carries over here. And with a figure of this size, it's far less forgivable. We are essentially dealing with an old-style Voyager, or I suppose a modern leader. The lack of a thigh swivel is unacceptable in my book. Whether it's figure damming remains to be seen, but it really pisses me off either way. Same with the knees, you only get 45 on these things. Not even anywhere close to 90. Come on, man! This isn't a deluxe limited by a $35 budget. This is a $250 combiner. And that's the real kicker at the end of the day, one that applies to the lackluster robot modes too. If memory serves me correct, the exchange rate for this leads to this combiner costing 250 Aussie dollary dues. I didn't pay that much, I got this mint and sealed box but second hand for 180. Whether dealing with my price or the retail price, that's a pretty good deal for 6 bots. But for a Voyager-sized robot, it's really lacking in quite a few areas. Now that being said, there is one thing with the pricing to keep in mind, one that might save this set. However, that will be discussed later. For the time time being, a lot of connections here really don't work. Hook keeps falling apart because the torso pegs aren't strong enough. The arms keep falling off because the tabs don't lock but rather rely on friction. Bone Crusher's head keeps falling down because there are no locking points. Yeah, just check the intro for this year's Legendary episodes. You can see what it's doing right there. The gun looks pretty nice, taking the G1 design and doing its own thing with it. But there's no tab to connect it into the hand. It relies on the dead space between the knuckles and the palm. And that space opens up when you try to clench the fist, meaning he can never hold it properly. Fortunately, everything below the waist is rock solid, but at this point, enough frustrations have piled up to make this set below par in the eyes of some. By some, of course, I mean the past version of me. Going through the issues is like a trip down memory lane. Sure, my opinion may not be the same as before, but I can see why I initially came to the conclusion I did. But the question remains, is it like this because of the all-in-one gimmick, or is it because of general amateurish design? Well, originally I thought it was the former thanks to the existence of a certain upgrade kit. Jesslyn Bell, designer extraordinaire, worked on a 3D printed Studio Ox upgrade kit, which I reviewed ages ago. It's since been taken down from Shapeways though, since people kept being idiots and expecting to get the full figure when they ordered it. They're up on Thingiverse now though. If y'all can't understand how to order it properly, print it your damn self! Actually, scratch that, it's been taken down from there too because KO companies kept stealing the design. This is why we can't have nice things. And yes, it does solve the articulation problem in the legs and even the forearms. It goes to show that parts forming is beneficial for a combiner, in spite of what certain fans might say. I'm a guy who hates unnecessary parts forming, but when it comes to combiners, I don't consider it unnecessary because the proof is in the pudding. That being said, looking back on it, the articulation issues may have been a result of the lack of parts forming, but the robot modes and combined mode solidity issues certainly aren't. It's clear to me that it's just from a general lack of understanding on what needs to be done on a legend scale combiner. There's a reason Iron Factory took far longer in getting around to taking a stab at it. It's a monumental undertaking. I just don't think DX9 had the know-how on what was required, nor the drive to tackle the hard problems. Hulky is a set plagued by both lack of understanding and lack of ambition, and that's why initially I was so frustrated with this release. However, there's two things to take into account. The first is the simple fact of its existence to begin with. When Hulky first released, there were only two Legends combiners on the market: Revenge of the Fallen Legends Devastator and Prime Beast Hunter's Abominus. Iron Factory's Bruticus and Magic Square's Menasor weren't even in the planning stage at this point. Hulky was a pioneer into uncharted territory. For that alone, a lot of leeway has to be given. It may not have much care put into the minute details, but in the concept and the bigger picture, DX9 really pushed it. And with all its flaws, when it gets good, it gets really good. The combined mode aesthetic is gorgeous, and the alt modes absolutely rock. And then we get to the second factor. You will not be paying $250 for this these days. You won't even be paying $180. Take it closer to the Voyager price point. Yes, you heard right. Here's what happened. Hulky's push into the newfound land of Legends combiners was noticed by every knockoff company under the sun. Matter of fact, I go as far as saying that Hulky is likely the most knocked off combiner on the planet, aside from Generation Toy Gravity Builder, who I think is tied with. And a lot of these bootlegs are actually pretty good. One of them was even made by Weijang, which is likely a safe bet if you want to go down the bootleg path. Thing is, you won't necessarily have to, thanks to the sheer abundance of unofficial versions on the market. If you can even call a third-party toy any semblance of official to begin with, the aftermarket prices for the original have plummeted. I've seen Hulky go from anywhere between $150 and $50 on the Aussie sales pages. Especially with the releases of New Ages and Magic Squares versions, Hulky has been deemed by the community as worthless. With those prices in mind, bootleg or no, and understanding the circumstances of which this figure came out in, I don't think I can be as harsh as I initially was on it. It's a flawed figure, to be sure, but as I grow older, I find myself respecting what it does more and more. If any of this has piqued your interest and you have a sort of hard-on for all-in-one combiners, now is the time to pick up a form of Hulky. For all we know, the two new versions from the battling companies could turn out terrible, and people may end up returning to this old fellow in an effort to remember better days. This is an opportune time to add Hulky to your collection, and for me, it's an opportune time to take a look back and reevaluate my stance on this release. I like to think that these days my criticisms are actually consistent, even if many people don't consider them such. With what I know now, I can't bring myself to hate this, and beyond that, it's part of my channel's history, so it will always have a special place in my heart. It may be a dumpy release that doesn't hold together in some cases and shows no regard for the individual robot modes, but in the end it brings a hulking mass of fun to my collection table, and that's gotta count for something. Cynicism towards certain parts of the franchise isn't always the worst thing to have. You can't always accept everything a certain work of fiction throws at you, or a certain toy line throws at you. You do have to step back sometimes and acknowledge that things aren't perfect, or in some cases that they are complete and utter dog shit. However, cynicism drawn from a lack of context isn't a space I often like to occupy. It is the curse of every YouTuber to fall into this trapping over and over and over again, and one day I'll look back at all of those moments and cringe very, very hard. However, the real test doesn't begin when you take that first step, but rather in that process of reflection. What I consider more important is the ability to change and evolve and realize maybe you didn't get everything right the first time around. DX9 Hulky is not perfect, even considering the restrictions placed on him, but I'd be lying if I said he was as bad as I initially thought. For every fumbling piece of engineering, there is a form of inspired parts usage. For every point where the all-in-one gimmick is a detriment to the design, there's a point where it's so good that I wish it was on every other Devastator. And now that the price has plummeted on the aftermarket, it's the perfect time to get this magnificent fellow. Maybe the parts forming on Hephaestus disgusts you, or maybe the upcoming Magic Square one, whatever it's called, has you concerned with some of its engineering. If so, this is a safe bet. It's got its problems, but it's still solid. It actually kind of ultimately makes me sad about the cancellation of the DX9 War and Pocket line. Like, I know New Age is better, but I was hyped for that Predaking. Yes, we have the Kang Toys one, but it's not the same, and New Age is just gonna tunify it. But enough dawdling what could have been. Let's celebrate what was. A combiner that may not have been the best, but still showed what was possible within the Legends niche. And that's why I do the marathon every year. It's a scale I absolutely adore, with endless possibilities. And I always love to see how it evolves and changes each year. So thank you for joining me this merry month, and I hope to see you again in the future. I hope you've enjoyed this neat little package, and I hope I've inspired you to try out some of these figures for yourselves. Especially if you weren't interested in Legends figures to begin with. That's why I do this, because there's an entire world of possibility at play here. And if you're skipping out, well, you're missing out. Greetings, Cybertronians. Just wanted to thank everyone for sticking with me over the course of the marathon and 2021 as a whole. I know this video came out a lot later than initially planned, but I got stuck with responsibilities whilst moving house and just a general sense of burnout after releasing the previous 29 videos. On the topic of going into 2022, I'm sadly not going to be able to put out as many videos. It's probably going to be 1 or 2 per month, especially with me going back into full-time study, and for a lot of the upcoming reviews, I'm having to film them right now before the move fully commences. But don't worry, the best and worst of 2021 videos are coming. The worst list has already been filmed, but I'm going to film the best list and another review first before starting editing. It's either that or they don't get made at all, sadly. That said, I hope you all enjoy what's to come. Until next time, take care of yourself. I mean it.